It's losing $400 million plus a day in lost revenue by the U.S. blockade. It has no cards to play, and all it can hope is that someone will call off the United States. And we'll talk about that in a later video. Who are those somethings or somebodies that might save Iran at the 11th hour? Because it will not be able to save itself if the United States decides to take out its bridges, take out its electrical generation capability, and force it back to the negotiating table, not to negotiate, but to submit to terms.
Submit to terms, not negotiate, submit. That distinction matters enormously because it tells you exactly where this campaign is in its arc. Iran has no military left, no revenue, no cards to play. The question being set up for the next video is who, if anyone, saves them at the 11th hour. But before we get there, we need to understand how Iran ended up here, because the answer to that question explains everything about what happens next.
We're now beginning the 7th week of military operations against Iran. They're in a lull now during a negotiation, but the war continues. And if you look at Iran, it's a very strange situation because its command and control have been decapitated. Its military has been, I guess you'd call it inert. There is no air force. There's only PT boats left of its navy. Its army is of no use since this is an air war. Its nuclear military industrial complex has been bombed to smithereens. It's probably lost $500 billion in a half-century-long investment in military hardware and military industries at the expense of a very restive population. So what was it thinking? How did it get in itself in this place? What happened to it? Well, it had a expansive view of itself, an inflated view. Why? During the Obama administration, the Obama State Department and Obama himself sent these messages to Iran that maybe a Shia crescent, maybe Tehran, Damascus, Beirut, Gaza, people in Yemen might balance the Sunni Arabs of the Gulf with their money and the military power of the Jewish state of Israel, and Obama might step in from time to time to adjudicate this, I guess they call it creative tension. In other words, we said there was no moral difference between the Iranian bloc and its opponents, when there was, of course. That gave the impression to Iran that we were afraid of them, or we would always be willing to make concessions. When Biden came in, the Iranians looked at him. The first thing he did was beg them to get back in the Iran deal. That inflated their egos even greater. Then he lifted sanctions and gave them $100 billion of new revenue. Meanwhile, the Iranians were looking at Russia going into Ukraine, and the United States had done nothing other than say our reaction will hinge on whether it's a minor or major invasion. And then came October 7th, and the Iranians had subsidized Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis and its proxies and clients in Syria and Iraq with the idea they had created a ring of fire around the Jewish state, and that after the October 7th massacres, which they denied they had foreknowledge, but they obviously strategically planned it with their clients, they thought that the United States wouldn't do anything, and they were pretty much right about that during the Biden administration. If even worse, we kind of distanced ourselves from Israel, and Iran knew that. And they felt that after October 7th, it would be such a traumatic experience for the Israeli government, they wouldn't do much. A lot of this was hinged on this pseudo-reputation they had of being militarily indomitable, invincible, but there was never any proof that was true. In the Iran-Iraq War of 1980, they didn't do very well. Khomeini had to sue for peace, even though they had almost 1.5 times the population of Iraq. But they were the terror of the Middle East. People said, whatever you do, go into Afghanistan, go into Iraq, bomb, don't get near Iran. They're crazy people. They have 93 million people. They're the second largest country in the Middle East by population. They're the second largest by area. They're just dangerous people. They're fanatic Shia, and they're willing to die for their cause.
The question being asked in that segment is the right one, and it's the one that almost no analyst in the current media cycle is seriously engaging with. How did Iran get here? How does the most militarily feared state in the Middle East, 93 million people, half a century of weapons investment, a network of proxies spanning 5 countries, end up in the 7th week of a campaign with no air force, no navy beyond patrol boats, a decapitated command structure, and $500 billion in military assets reduced to rubble? The answer starts with a misreading of American intent that was actively encouraged by 2 successive administrations. Obama's contribution to this catastrophe for Iran, ultimately, was the doctrine of creative tension. The explicit or implicit message sent to Tehran during those years was that a Shia crescent balancing Sunni Gulf power and Israeli military strength was not something the United States would actively oppose. Iran was being repositioned in American strategic thinking as a legitimate regional counterweight rather than a designated adversary. That signal was received in Tehran exactly as you would expect, as evidence that Washington was either afraid of them or had decided to accommodate them. Either interpretation produced the same result: an Iranian government that grew more aggressive, more expansionist, and more confident that American restraint was permanent. Biden then compounded it structurally. His administration's first visible act toward Iran was to beg them to return to the nuclear deal. That posture, supplicant before a government that had been running assassination campaigns against American officials, communicated something specific about the correlation of forces as Biden's team understood it. Then came the sanctions relief and the unfreezing of roughly $100 billion in revenue. Whatever the stated rationale, the practical effect was to refinance the regime at a moment when maximum economic pressure had been the most effective tool available. Iran took the money, kept the nuclear program moving, and drew exactly the lesson you would expect an adversarial government to draw from that sequence of events. Russia's invasion of Ukraine added another data point. The Biden administration's response, telegraphed in advance, calibrated carefully to avoid escalation, hedged with the minor incursion language, told every adversarial government watching that American deterrence had become conditional and negotiable. Iran was watching, they concluded, reasonably given the evidence, that the United States under that leadership would absorb provocations up to a threshold that was both high and clearly signaled in advance. October 7th was the product of all of this accumulated miscalculation. Iran had spent years building the Ring of Fire. Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, proxies in Syria and Iraq, with the explicit strategic purpose of surrounding Israel with a sustained threat that could be activated simultaneously. The calculation was that after a massacre of that scale, Israel would be traumatized into paralysis, the United States would distance itself further from Jerusalem, and the international pressure on Israel to absorb the attack without decisive response would be overwhelming. Iran was not entirely wrong about the international pressure dimension. It was catastrophically wrong about Israel. But here is the part of the analysis that cuts deepest. Iran's military reputation was always substantially fictional. The Iran-Iraq War of 1980 should have been the tell. Iran had nearly 1.5 times Iraq's population and fought to a bloody stalemate that required Khomeini to accept a ceasefire he described as drinking poison. Their battlefield performance was not impressive. Everything that came after, the fear, the deference, the careful avoidance, was built not on demonstrated conventional military capability, but on terrorism, assassination, proxy networks, and the successful cultivation of a reputation for unpredictable fanaticism. They were feared the way a cornered animal is feared. not because of genuine military power, but because of the perceived willingness to cause damage out of proportion to any rational calculation. That reputation was the foundation, and a reputation built on perception rather than capability is exactly the kind of foundation that collapses completely once the perception is tested.
But if you actually looked at what they had done, they had achieved that reputation through surrogate use of terrorism, blowing up embassies, blowing up Marine barracks, assassinating individuals, sending weaponry to kill Americans in Afghanistan and Iraq. But they'd never really shown any impressive performance on the battlefield, either at sea, on the ground, or in the air. And then so they thought they could get away with October 7th. And that gave them even a greater inflated sense of self, because they kept telling us that between all of their proxies and their own arsenals, they might have 300,000 short and long-range missiles, rockets, and drones, and they would collapse Israel under a sea of explosives. So they thought that even after October 7th, Israel wouldn't dare do anything to them because they had sophisticated Chinese and Russian air defenses. What they didn't count on were two things. October 7th changed the entire mentality of Israel. It was the greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. And they said, you cannot live like this. You cannot sustain a country like this. You can't have a sword of Damocles like this descending on you periodically. So we're going to have to go to the head of the snake. Hezbollah will deal with yes. Hamas we're going to deal with. The Houthis we will deal with. The people in Syria will deal with. But in one way or the other, they get money and weapons from Tehran. And we don't believe that they're indomitable. Not now, not after October 7th. And so in that 12-day war of last year, they destroyed the entire air defenses of Iran. And then they began taking out its military capability and its nuclear industry and infrastructure, and they called us in and asked us, and we were more than ready to comply because it was in our national interest. And in about 25 or 30 hours, we blew up their nuclear facilities. We thought that might be the end. They got the message, but of course they didn't. Their proxies began to shoot missiles again. They began to, from our intelligence, resume work on their nuclear facilities and nuclear proliferation trajectory, and so the United States entered negotiations again with them. And like all negotiations with the Iranians, they're drawn out, they're meant to delay while they rearm, or they enrich more uranium, or they sick their terrorist appurtenances on Israel or on individuals in the West as terrorist attacks. But they didn't again count on that Donald Trump doesn't care and Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't care. And so they resumed the war, and now we're speaking as we go into the seventh week. All of its assets are destroyed. It's losing $400 million plus a day in lost revenue by the U.S. blockade. It has no cards to play, and all it can hope is that someone will call off the United States. And we'll talk about that in a later video. Who are those somethings or somebodies that might save Iran at the 11th hour? Because it will not be able to save itself if the United States decides to take out its bridges, take out its electrical generation capability, and force it back to the negotiating table, not to negotiate, but to submit to terms.
October 7th didn't just change Israel, it changed the strategic logic of the entire region. And Iran didn't see it coming because it couldn't. The attack was the greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, and the Israeli conclusion drawn from it was not to absorb it, manage it, or respond proportionally. It was to eliminate the conditions that made it possible permanently. The head of the snake. What followed was methodical. Hezbollah degraded. Hamas engaged. Houthis bombed for 56 days. Syrian proxies addressed. And then in a 12-day operation last year, Israeli strikes destroyed Iran's entire air defense network. That single achievement, taking out the air defenses before any sustained campaign began, Ojur Amandi in Indi is Durtain Butan showed what made everything that followed possible. You cannot defend territory you cannot see coming. Iran lost that capability before the main campaign started. After that, the trajectory was fixed. Iran's countermeasure was the one it always reaches for: negotiation as delay. Draw out the talks. Use the time to rearm, re-enrich, rebuild, bleed the political will of the opposing side through process while reconstituting capability through the back door. It worked with Obama, it worked with Biden. The entire JCPOA architecture was, from Iran's operational perspective, a delay mechanism, time purchased under diplomatic cover while the nuclear program continued in slower gear. Trump and Netanyahu simply declined to participate in the delay. That refusal, which sounds obvious stated plainly, Masma, was in practice the decisive variable. Every previous American administration had, at some point, accepted Iranian negotiating drag as the cost of avoiding escalation. This one didn't. When the talks stalled and the proxies resumed firing and the intelligence showed nuclear work restarting, the response was not another round of diplomacy. It was the resumption of bombing. Iran had no contingency for an adversary that refused to be delayed. The result is the situation at the end of that segment. 7 weeks in, all assets destroyed, $400 million a day in lost revenue, no military capability remaining, no cards to play. The final escalation available to the United States, bridges, electrical generation, the full dual-use infrastructure campaign, hasn't even been deployed yet. It's being held in reserve as the lever that produces submission rather than negotiation. That distinction, submit to terms, not negotiate, is the clearest possible statement of where the power relationship now stands. Iran is not bargaining from a position. It is calculating how long it can survive before the next escalation makes survival the only negotiating position left.